Thank you, Paula, and to all you newly minted bunchies, it is my very great honor and pleasure to join in congratulating you for successfully completing the American Political Science Association's 2019 Ralph Bunche Summer Institute. I know this is an exciting but intense program, and you can all feel proud that you have reached this point. We at APSA are all proud of you. Now, I want to talk with you a few minutes about what comes next. Many of you are still deciding where you want to go and what you want to do after your undergraduate years. We devoutly hope that a lot of you will enroll in graduate programs in political science, but I'm not here to urge you to do that. Part of the mission of political science, maybe the most important part, is to equip young people to be more knowledgeable and skillful citizens, whatever occupations they may pursue. We believe the technical skills and the substantive knowledge about politics you've learned here will help you to help the world as citizens, whatever else you do. But to be honest, if you're not going into political science, I don't have much useful advice to give you. So, I hope most, if not all of you, are still considering it. I also want to stress at the outset that if you do go into political science, after getting some basic methodological and substantive grounding in the discipline, you should focus on whatever political questions seem most important to you, using whatever methods are best suited to answer those questions. Now, the Ralph Bunche Summer Institute is for students with backgrounds traditionally underrepresented in political science, predominantly racial and ethnic backgrounds, and many of you may choose to focus on political issues relating to your experiences and identities. That's reasonable and commendable, but not mandatory. You're people with many interests, and you'll contribute most if you focus on doing those things that interest you the most. But a high percentage of former RBSI students do work on issues of race and ethnicity. I know that a lot of you do. And so, as someone who's done some study of the history of American political science and who's just been around it for a long time, I want to talk with you tonight giving some background on the place of studies of race and ethnicity in the discipline of political science. I think all political scientists should be more aware that, unfortunately, American political science began in the late 19th century as an explicitly racist discipline. The first two departments to become leading producers of political science PhDs, the Johns Hopkins program, led by Herbert Baxter Adams, that trained Woodrow Wilson, and the Columbia program, led by John Burgess, that trained Theodore Roosevelt, both taught politics and history as stories of the evolutionary triumphs of the white Anglo-Saxon or Teutonic races, allegedly the only races proven capable of liberty and self-governance. Their students, particularly Woodrow Wilson, went on to become architects of Jim Crow systems of disfranchisement and segregation. What we now know as the subfield of international relations similarly began with a focus on the problems of imperial governance, understood chiefly in terms of racial differences. Its leading publication was called the Journal of Race Development, later renamed Foreign Affairs. By the 1920s, most political scientists were abandoning theories of Anglo-Saxon or white supremacy, a shift that accelerated as the rise of the Nazis and then World War II led more and more white Americans to define themselves as opposed to racism. But the mainstream political science discipline's former emphasis on white racial superiority did not give way in these decades to a new focus on egalitarian racial progress. Instead, with a few exceptions like Chicago's Harold Gosnell, most mainstream white scholars neglected studies of the politics of America's racial minorities. V.O. Key did famously study the role of race in Southern politics, but his focus was on what white politicians were doing. As African Americans slowly began to be admitted to PhD programs in political science, their research on racial topics attracted very little attention in the discipline. Gosnell cited in part, he relied in part on the early work of Ralph Bunche, who was the first African American PhD in political science and later the first African American president of the American Political Science Association, and of course, the person for whom this program is named. But Ralph Bunche once remarked that he had focused his scholarly career on international relations because there wasn't, quote, a very cordial reception in political science for his papers dealing with domestic racial issues. This neglect of the role of race, particularly in American politics, damaged scholarship and teaching in political science. It meant that most white political scientists failed to perceive or analyze the rise of the civil rights movement in the 1950s until very late in the day, as APSA President David Easton admitted in 1969. And when mainstream political scientists did discuss civil rights struggles, they generally treated them simply as efforts to eliminate formal barriers to the integration of African Americans into the nation's polling booths and job markets. They did not analyze very deeply the complex intertwining of race and class and gender interests and identities that had generated systematic political and economic exclusions and subordinations in the first place. Most white political scientists were also blind to the ways that calls for integration could amount to compulsory assimilation into the practices of white middle-class American society in ways that for many African Americans involve losses of identity and continuing barriers to their distinctive economic and political aspirations. African American political science is frustrated with these deficiencies in the discipline's mainstream and with the limited opportunities that APSA offered them, created what became the National Conference of Black Political Scientists in 1969 as an autonomous vehicle for addressing these concerns. I had the honor earlier this year to represent APSA at INCOPE's 50th anniversary, and I noted that its members have over the last half century, strengthened the discipline of political science in three distinct and vital ways. First, INCOPE's helped to advance the intellectual careers of scholars of color, primarily Black and Latino. And those scholars have helped the discipline as a whole to achieve more nuanced understanding of many things, but especially issues of race, because they did research and teaching that was richly informed by the experiences, analyses, and insights of those who did not share white privileges. Second, INCOPES has helped scholars of color to push back against continuing discrimination in the profession, and it has served as a vital training ground for leaders of the entire discipline. 3 past presidents of INCOPES have gone on to become presidents of the American Political Science Association: Lucius Barker, Diane Pinderhughes, and my successor, Professor Paula McClain. But third is a contribution of INCOPES and related activities that, even more than the first two, has been insufficiently understood and appreciated by many mainstream political scientists in ways that still matter now and for the years ahead. As Joseph McCormick stressed in an article on the early development of INCOPES, the organization has always welcomed and fostered an activist scholar ethos. Many of its members have seen their academic work as part of broader struggles to achieve progress in the larger world by pursuing the full liberation of people of color in ways that will ultimately expand opportunities for all. Now again, that legacy doesn't mean that you personally have to work on issues of race or be an activist scholar. I've known talented scholars who felt burdened by pressures to become great leaders of social change when they felt themselves basically to be introspective nerds, like, for example, me. And they were intellectually curious about lots of things beyond racial injustices. But I've also known many more scholars of color who grew disillusioned with political science because they felt the discipline didn't value work on racial and ethnic issues, especially engaged research that was part of active efforts to combat racial injustices. It's too often been seen as discreditable if a political scientist, particularly a political scientist of color, reveals that she really cares about politics and making people's lives better through political science research and teaching. Today, although the discipline has progressed in many ways, in part through the contributions of many great scholars of color, we still have further improvements to make. I think it is chiefly because we still do not pay enough attention to the ways racial statuses and identities shape politics, and even more to the way that politics shapes racial identities and statuses, that we largely failed once again to anticipate the rise of Donald Trump and the rule of racial resentments, along with other grievances, in that rise. In the 2 decades preceding the election of 2016, the dominant message in the discipline was that racial concerns were receding in importance, even if less explicit dog whistle racial appeals still had power. In 2005, Desmond King and I argued that this limited attention to the racial dimensions of modern American politics was insufficient, that race-related conflicts were so pervasive and impactful that we said, and I quote, "The question of what role race may be playing should always be part of political science inquiries." This argument hardly stemmed from our professional or personal self-interest. Neither of us are simply scholars of racial politics, and we're not scholars of color. Both King and I work on a lot of other topics, and the truth is there aren't many people who are whiter than King and Smith, at least as whiteness is conventionally understood. Our contention stemmed strictly from evidence and analysis, but nonetheless, it was attacked as ideological, unscientific, even anti-science. After Trump's triumphs, some political scientists have swung, if anything, too much the other way, contending that racism alone explains everything about Trump's appeal in ways that neglect how policies of economic globalization and elite cultural disdain for more traditionally religious Americans have also fueled some voters' discontents. As a discipline, we're still not succeeding in coming to grips with the complex entanglements of racial and economic and cultural systems of inequality that have been so central for so long to American political life. Scholars in comparative politics have often done better in dealing with issues of racial and ethnic as well as religious conflict, but even so, many failed to anticipate the rise of conservative, anti-immigrant, anti-minority nationalist figures like Viktor Orban in Hungary, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Modi in India, and many others. The largest single development in the political world today is the rise of movements who claim to be populist, but who often favor traditionally dominant groups against traditionally oppressed groups, and who are increasingly willing to use authoritarian means. And most white mainstream political scientists, once again, didn't see this coming. One reason is that partly because of suspicions about activist scholars, we have marginalized instead of rewarding civically engaged research, research that is done collaboratively with an array of groups, communities, and organizations, cooperating with them in deciding what questions to ask, how to answer them, and what answers are desirable. We've done field work, but often with survey questions and experimental designs written with our internal political science debates primarily in view, rather than listening to what's on other people's minds. As a result, I think we've been slow to recognize, much less anticipate, many significant emerging political movements, from the Tea Party and Trumpism to Black Lives Matters and Me Too to the resurgence of democratic socialists. To address this, my APSA task force has started a new summer Institute for Civically Engaged Research, or ICER is the acronym, which I attended at Tufts last week. And we've created a new APSA award for distinguished civically engaged research. I hope some of you will participate in ICER, in the Summer Institute one day, and perhaps go on to win that Civic Engagement Award, because I think civically engaged research is one valuable way to study politics and one that we've neglected. And I see that neglect as part of a broader pattern of neglect that has included not listening enough to the voices of scholars of color and other traditionally underrepresented minorities, many of whom have been more engaged with more groups than most political scientists, and many of whom saw the emerging trends toward intolerant, authoritarian, sometimes overtly racist forms of so-called populism sooner and more clearly than the discipline as a whole. So I believe, and I think many in the discipline are coming to believe, that we need more of those traditionally underrepresented voices, and we need to give greater prominence to those voices now and in the years ahead. This means we need you. If and only if you decide that researching and teaching about politics is what you want to do, to be personally fulfilled and to make a contribution to the world. Let me underline again, I hope first and foremost that all of you will pursue choices that you can make work out wonderfully well for you, whatever those choices are. But I confess, I hope that many of you will choose to join our ranks in political science. I'm confident that the Ralph Bunche Summer Institute has prepared you well to do so. And I believe that if many of you make that choice, then the discipline of political science, guided not just by old white guys like me, but by brilliant and eternally youthful colleagues like Dr. McClain.
We're the same age, Roger.
But some are younger at heart and spirit. But I think if more of you make that choice, then there is a better chance that our discipline of political science will transcend our dishonorable origins and help to make the political world more inclusive, more egalitarian, and more just than it has ever been.